So today I'm at Quaker Park, a park that was once known as Fremont Park, and it has a lot of rich history in the city of Battle Creek. So I thought I would explore some of that today. Come along and join me. To better understand the historical significance of Quaker Park, we must first look at the 100-year history of the existence of the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, in the early pioneer period of the founding of the village of Battle Creek. What was the Quaker Movement? The Religious Society of Friends, also referred to as the Quaker Movement, was founded in England in the 17th century by George Fox. He and other early Quakers, or Friends, were persecuted for their beliefs, which included the idea that the presence of God exists in every person. Quakers rejected elaborate religious ceremonies, didn't have official clergy, and believed in spiritual equality for men and women. Quaker missionaries first arrived in the United States in the mid-1650s. Quakers who practiced pacifism played a key role in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. But more on that in just a few minutes. The origin of the Society of Friends in Battle Creek dates back to 1837, the year when the three Merritt brothers, Joseph, Isaac, and Abraham, and their brother-in-law Jonathan Hart, came to the little wilderness settlement to develop the land they had bought from General Ezra Canvas and Nathaniel Barney, pioneer settlers in 1835. Actually, they had bought a half interest in the village of Battle Creek, becoming joint owners with Sans McCamley, including an interest in the water power. An article that ran in the Inquirer and News in 1972 discussed a diary of Joseph Merritt written in 1835. In it, he described their journey from New York to Michigan. They came by way of the Erie Canal, and in those days, the canal was a busy place. He wrote that they had to wait for 120 boats to pass before they could get started on their journey. Once landing in Michigan, they made their way through the wilderness on ponies, following Indian trails and paths marked by trees, traveling through Saline, Clinton, Tecumseh, Adrian, eventually arriving into Hillsdale County and stopping in Jonesville, and finally heading northwest into Calhoun County. If you'd like some more context on this period of history in Battle Creek, I have two other videos concerning Ezra Canvas and Sans McCamley that I'll put the links to in the description of this video. Jonathan Hart came to Michigan from Washington County, New York, with his wife Mary, who was a sister of the Merritt brothers. As a subtle twist of irony, Joseph Merritt married Jonathan's sister, Phoebe. So this kind of made Jonathan Hart and Joseph Merritt double brothers-in-laws, or something of the sort. Joseph Merritt owned a large tract of land off of present-day Capitol Avenue. His house still stands today on the corner of Northeast Capitol and Orchard Place, and it is the historic Northside Family Practice Building. By the 1873 atlas, the home at that time was indicated as being owned by his son Charles Merritt. Jonathan Hart, who later established the Hart Mill, the first flour mill in Battle Creek, and became one of Battle Creek's earliest successful millers, his home was on the site of where the present-day YMCA stands. Isaac Merritt was the youngest of three brothers. He owned a house on Main Street, now known as Michigan Avenue, which eventually became the American Hotel, a popular place in its time. The building later burned, but it was approximately located at where the Cafe Rica is in present-day downtown. Abraham Merritt never lived in Battle Creek. He came here for periods of as much as a month at a time to help with family business interests. He helped, however, to build the first Quaker meeting house in 1843. This was built on the site of the present-day St. Philip's Catholic Church. There, for nearly 20 years, the Society of Friends gathered and held their services. When the Merritts and the Harts arrived in Battle Creek, they brought with them not only their religious beliefs, but also their beliefs in the abolition of slavery. Joseph and Phoebe Merritt kept their home open as a prominent meeting place for anti-slavery workers, having as their frequent guests such notable persons as William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist journalist and publisher of the widely read anti-slavery journal, The Liberator. They also had Henry C. Wright, the Connecticut-born abolitionist who was also a writer for Garrison's Liberator. Then they had the famous abolitionist and attorney and son of the first mayor of Boston, Wendell Phillips. They also had Lucy Stone, the famous abolitionist, suffragist, and vocal advocate for women's rights. She was the first woman from Massachusetts to earn a college degree. There was also the famous minister Parker Pillsbury, who widely lectured on abolition and social reform across the country. He was a prominent figure in his writing and his lecturing in the abolitionist movement. And of course, they had at their home, as a frequent speaker, Sojourner Truth, a former slave and nationally renowned abolitionist and women's suffrage speaker who arrived in Battle Creek in 1856, brought by Quaker Henry Mills. She bought a home in Harmonia initially, but eventually moved to the Battle Creek area off of College Street. She was known to be quick and witty and spontaneous and a very moving speaker who could engage an audience and was often considered to be the right woman at the right place at the right time in history. From the very start of their arrival in Battle Creek, the early Quakers busied themselves in the interest of abolition. Joseph Merritt himself never took to the platform over the issue, but he devoted his time at his home to the cause. It was Erastus Hussey, a downtown merchant here in Battle Creek, who carried out the burden of handling Battle Creek's Underground Railroad station. He became known as the station master, and he also published his own publications over the years. He built a large house where he reputedly had a special place in the cellar for runaway slaves. It was located at the corner of North Washington Avenue and Manchester Street. It is estimated that over 1,000 slaves were transported to safety and stayed in his home over the years that he held the operation. 3 years into the Civil War, on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Quakers began to see a decline in membership, so they sold their meeting house at auction for the sum of $1,100 to the early Catholic settlers later that same year. The Catholic congregation continued to use the building until 1879, when a new edifice was erected. The Quaker Society of Friends seemed to go into a decline during this period. Hussey himself described it by saying that the mission of the old abolition party and also that of the Quakers had been given. They had performed their part, and their day being over, they could retire from the stage of action. Another factor that played a part in it was the rise of spiritualism, which also made inroads among the local Quakers. Spiritualism was a religious movement that started in the 1840s in Hydesville, New York. It was launched in part by the Fox sisters, and it was a belief system that the spirits of the dead exist and have both the ability and the inclination to communicate with the living. I covered some of the history of the Fox sisters and spiritualism and the growth of it here in Battle Creek during the 19th century period when it was very popular in my video Searching for Harmonia, which I'll include the link to in this video's description. Over a period of years following the Civil War, a number of the Friends and members of other sects held meetings calling themselves by names such as the Progressive Friends, Progressive Spiritualist Society, and First Society of Spiritualists. The granddaughter of Joseph Merritt, Mrs. Minnie Merritt Fay, recalled that her father, Charles Merritt, son of Joseph, had become interested in the new movement, but he remained a stout Quaker. She says he used to remark that it was a beautiful thing to have faith in the spirit of life and the dead. The Quakers moved to Michigan Avenue and Stringham Road and remained there until they moved again, building a new meeting house on their burying grounds in 1871 at the site that we know today as Quaker Park. They saw an increase again in membership between 1870 and 1880, but by 1899
there was only one lone soul left of the Quaker following, George Case, who continued to travel from the country to hold services by himself at the meeting house. He continued to do this until about 1918, when his health would no longer permit him to travel. In 1899, the Quaker Society of Friends leased their burying grounds to the city of Battle Creek for the sum of $50 a year for the period of 99 years. The payment was to be made to the Quaker Pelham Half-Yearly Meeting of Canada, which the local church was affiliated, which expired in 1998. In the agreement, the city would establish a park, but they also specified that that park should never be used to exhibit a circus or any other show of amusement. The park was named Fremont Park in 1899, and the meeting house remained at the park, still used by George Case, as mentioned before, until about 1918. It was then used as a storage facility for the Parks and Recreation Department, and it was given its last coat of paint in 1932. It was later deemed a fire hazard and torn down in 1946. Fremont Park had a name change to Quaker Park in 1921, when a stone was erected in the park dedicated to the history of the Quaker heritage and the burying ground. Since that time, there have been several other historic markers posted at the park, including a concrete memorial to the foundation of the meeting house, and inside that foundation you can find a plaque dedicated to Sojourner Truth, which includes a cast of the shoe prints of Truth in concrete. The location of the foundation may not be original to where the original meeting house stood. In present-day Quaker Park, the location of the monument to the foundation of the meeting house may not be accurate as to where it originally stood when the Quakers used it, as the 1873 atlas shows the meeting house to be very close to the front of the park, and the present foundation is actually in the center of the park. I found a reference in an article indicating the meeting house had been moved to the rear end of the park when it was made into Fremont Park. The meeting house, as you can see in this photo at the time it was being torn down, had two doors on the front of it. One was used for the men and the other for the women. There was a colonnade separating them, and they worshipped in silence. The graves at the cemetery were moved between 1899 and 1900 to Oak Hill Cemetery. One very interesting story from the period that I found described the discovery of a peculiar iron casket for a woman that they had no records for at the time. The casket was made of iron and was very detailed, and it had a pure silver plate with her name on it, Mary A. Mott, aged 59. The name was not known to the Mott families at that time. And here's an excerpt from that article showing that it also had 6 iron casket rings to carry it with, and it was neatly crafted to the shape of the woman's body. Another article that ran in the Chicago Tribune described the coffin as it is shaped to fit the body of a woman as perfectly as if the hot iron had been poured around her form. A few days after the initial articles ran, one of the pioneer citizens of the area recalled the actual burial of Miss Mary Mott. And it appears that she was originally from Albany, New York. She was a member of an aristocratic Quaker family in the East. She was a sister-in-law of a local Battle Creek citizen. She had considerable wealth, and when she died, her body was transported for burial in the Quaker cemetery. In total, the Quaker presence in Battle Creek lasted approximately 100 years. Today, one can walk around Quaker Park and read the historical markers and perhaps get a sense of the time period and the influence of the Quaker history, as well as the history of the Abolitionist movement here in Battle Creek.
That's going to do it for exploring some of the history of Quaker Park here in Battle Creek. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.